All right, off we go. Thank you for joining us this morning. Darren Doherty here yet again. Today we're going to be discussing fencing. So we're up to week 10 in this 13-week program, and fencing is often a topic that is one that's more at the front of people's mind rather than at week 10 of their mind. So yeah, well, let's get into it. We really have three policies, if you like, or three perspectives that we look to have people look at. And one is that we suggest that people fence according to topography, that they, wherever possible, fence using electricity, and fence knowing that it's, well, not now, it's 2019, not 1000 BC. They're the perspectives that we really have to offer here. When I did the 2016 Rex tour, one of the things that sort of became apparent to me was that there were a number of styles of fences, and that because as you already know, I like to categorize things, and so I looked at these styles and went, okay, well, there's perimeter fences, there's yards or corrals, as some people call them in different places. There's laneways, there's subdivision fences, and then there's temporary fences. And within those, there's a whole range of different types of fences that people use, be they, even for perimeter fencing, people might use electricity. Others, as more commonly, would use really, really heavy fencing, ditto for yards and so on and so forth. One thing that we do look at, though, and this is where we go up and look at as we do with all of the layers, you start with your climate and determine, well, how's all of this going to fit? How does it look with our aesthetic that we've defined? How does it work financially, and so on? Is it a big priority for us, or can we make do? We look at it geographically and say, all right, well, if we have a whole farm layout, well then, how is the fence going to fit in within that layout? And should we look at the land elements of the property and use the changes in those land elements as places upon which to place fences? Certainly, in the era since we developed the soil conservation methodology, people did in the 1930s. Particularly since then, when land classes were developed, that often became the land class division was often determined as a place where a fence may well be placed. Some of the rules have changed as have materials, and material changes have really driven in large part the changes that we now see. So let's look at perimeter fences. Now, I've got another form of this presentation where I've looked at the evolution of fencing and some of the changes that have occurred. One of the biggest, I got up very early this morning for some reason, but anyway, one of the biggest changes that has occurred since the era of the stone or rock fence, which is one of the oldest types of fences, has been the advent of barbed wire, and I've got a little slideshow that speaks to that, and how revolutionary barbed wire was. I'm of the opinion, a few people have said, what are some of the most powerful inventions? I think Joel Salatin is one who says electric fencing and the toothbrush. I would say over the colonial period, probably one of the biggest innovations outside of the steam engine and its conversion into the internal combustion engine would be barbed wire, because it enabled people to be able to colonize areas where there were no stones and no trees, which were the traditional materials for making fences. And it allowed us to, over extraordinary areas, manage livestock like we never had before. So, and allowed us to manage those livestock in set stocked regimes. And so, of course, that had an enormous impact on ecosystems across the planet, particularly in places like the United States, the grasslands of the United States, Australia, South America, and Africa in particular, all of which have quite brittle landscapes, and accordingly, as we've discussed this week and before in the workplace, brittle landscapes can be defined as those where humidity is, the time of humidity over a year is relatively short, and that with rest in a landscape from the managed grazing of livestock, biodiversity actually declines, and so too does ground cover as a result. So very powerful stuff, fencing, in terms of what it can do to a landscape, particularly, and I suppose the fence is the aid to the manager because it keeps animals in, it keeps animals from going where they want to go. Animals being migratory, if they didn't have fences, well, then they would just, assume a migratory path through a whole landscape, which would be well outside the boundaries of any given property. So that being the case, it's important that when we do have fences of whatever type or configuration, that it still comes back to us being good managers and using a planned grazing regime to determine where animals should be and where activities should happen. As Kirk Gadzia says, we should have animals in the right place at the right time for the right reason. And the fencing is really just a support to that. And it really doesn't matter what kind of fencing it is. It's the management is of greater importance, and a management layer, of course, is within the soils layer. So other forms of perimeter fencing, it's quite common to these days, particularly in places like Australia, where we have, and I know it's not just Australia, but other places as well, where native animals, native grazing animals are sometimes increasing in numbers due to various conservation efforts and for other reasons. Declines in predators, opening up of areas with permanent water supplies, all sorts of different reasons. There are, as a result of that, pressures on landholders to consider building exclusion fences, or feral fences as they're sometimes called. And here's some examples of those in action and some of the features that you might look at having. This one here on the main photo here is of a client of ours in Pennsylvania, outside of a town called Carversville. And what they've done here, this is a 9-foot high, so it's quite a tall fence and a very expensive one with these creosote treated pine posts. I can't remember the price per foot of this fence, but it was very expensive. But what it enabled is for them to be able to practice agriculture within that wasn't going to be predated upon, or I should say, to have a grazing plan operate without the undue pressure of hundreds of deer and other graziers coming in. And so This is a case over here where we've got these other photos of where we've got a range of different options here. We've got the folded apron where the base of the fence actually folds out so that animals, which they typically will do, and that is to try and dig under a fence first. This has also got in place something that I will typically do with fences as well, and that's put a barb on perimeter fences where I'm trying to exclude animals. Is to typically put a barbed wire, heavy 2.5 mil, heavily coated barbed wire on the base there, just an inch or two above the ground, and that in the absence of having an apron I've found that it will suffice in a lot of cases, because animals get a memory pretty quickly. They usually follow the same pathways, usually kangaroos, wallabies, deer, etc. And so pigs even as well. If they come along and get a nose full of barbed wire, then they tend to remember that, and because that's what they typically will do, and that in itself will be an avoidance. The other thing it does is it provides you with a base wire onto which you can clip the prefabricated wire that may make up that main fence. So I haven't seen the aprons to be completely necessary, and certainly they add to the cost of a fence. And it may be that you, like here, you might want to retrofit an apron on later, but these are things to be determined. This here is more of a full wildlife fence, and this is where, and I've built these in the past, way back in the 90s. I built a vineyard which had the main grazing animal, and this was geese and ducks. And the client decided to, there was a lot of fox pressure and there was a lot of fox predation, which was quite sad, as it always is, carnage in fact. And so they decided to build an exclusion fence. And what we did was something quite similar to here, except it was more of a hybrid of this kind of fence, but on the top of it, we had the folded out section on the bottom, which was like this. It was like poultry netting. And then on the top, we had a sort of a floppy section. And that floppy section was such that for any animals such as cats, etc., that might climb, and that's what this fence is, a cat-proof fence. If they were to climb, then the fence will actually collapse down on themselves, and it's impossible for them to get over. So, you know, there's various types, and then there's the type of outrigger style fence where people might have, this is a retrofit, where they've installed these this metal rod, put some ceramic insulators on, and then put an electric wire on both sides or on one side, and so on. So there's a variety of ways in which one can attack that. The Clipex company have come along in the last few years. Ray and Samantha, are you aware of any examples of negative unintended consequences of exclusion fencing? Yeah, we had a bit of a discussion. I think if I go back away in the last Rex, Robin O'Day, who's in South Australia, she's got about 1,200 hectares. And if I recall, I'll just see if I can get to that. If I recall, one of the big discussions that we had there, I'll put Robin O'Day. Fencing. Thank you, my love. Let's see if we've got. Yeah. So we. It's water. Let's see if we can find that. Here we go. I don't think it's there. Anyway, let's park that, Ray. But there was and maybe just send me a in the fencing layer, so the actual fencing layer. let's have a look and see if we can find that that thread, because we had a lot of discussion from a lot of people around the positives and negatives of doing these types of fencing systems, and it was very, very interesting discussion. To summarize, a lot of people were obviously concerned about the negative impacts that, especially on larger properties, I have to say, not smaller properties. I wouldn't say this is as big a problem. Still is, but not as big. Was on the migratory natural movement, on stopping and adjusting the natural movement of livestock, of wild animals in their natural habitat. And that was probably one of the biggest concerns. Also, the prospect that it may concentrate animals into particular areas, and so on. It's certainly, I think, going to be something that comes up as a big concern, an ecological concern, one might say, and I don't know how well this has been addressed with the so-called community fencing systems that are being developed, particularly in outback Queensland and New South Wales, where a whole range of people are getting together, and large station owners in particular, and they're investing together as a community of farmers, of producers, in fencing off multiple properties as opposed to fencing off individual properties. And that obviously makes the whole operation a lot less expensive, because if you're fencing off individual properties, well, then you've got a lot of neighbouring properties which, or boundaries which may not necessarily, or wouldn't need to be fenced if one was to fence a greater area. Now, that's going to have some significant consequences for the for pasture access to native animals. It also depends on what you're excluding too, because a lot of fences are very exclusionary. I mean, they exclude even some of the smaller marsupials and smaller native animals, not just perhaps the target animals, the usual target animals of modernity, such as kangaroos and wallabies, and other wild livestock as well. So camels, donkeys, horses, etc. So yeah, I think that's going to be one of the main things that happens. And it's a big question about, particularly on larger properties, how do we holistically coexist? And it's clear from what I've seen that because of the breakdown in the broader ecology of whole nations, in that we've taken out predators and we've done this and we've done that, we've in some cases increased the numbers of some livestock, of some native animals in some areas, in excess of what there would have been pre-European or pre-human. That in itself has created a whole range of imbalances which we're now having to deal with. It's pretty clear that a lot of properties, because of that imbalance, are not viable currently, because of the free mouths to feed. That opens up, as we discussed, a whole range of other discussion points around about the lack of commercial access to these natural animals. In other words, if we have animals who are coming onto a property and they're grazing and they just happen to be native, generally in most jurisdictions, or in many jurisdictions, you're not actually able to harvest those animals and sell them commercially, and so therefore it's only that diminishes your ability to make a dollar out of animals who are otherwise getting a free lunch. So it's a very, very tough and difficult and wide-ranging question, that one. So thank you. All right, getting back to it. Yeah, so ClipX have put the cat amongst the pigeons, as it were, when it comes to fencing systems, with the advent of this steel post design, which has this little clip on it. It's a really cool design, and it, having used it, it saves about 90% of the time it takes to erect a fence. And a lot of the work that's done in erecting a fence is actually in connecting the wires to the posts that are holding the fence up. And so they've done a really good job in creating this little movable clip here, which pivots on this top one here and moves backwards and then forwards on a spring. And so it basically turns the fence into a coat hanger. And so you can literally just push the wire in, and it's a one-way in. And then if you want to take it out, well, then you can manually push this back and then take the wire off if you like as well. So it's useful for dismantling, which may happen for a variety of reasons. These posts also have conventional wire holes as well. So that's a pretty big innovation that's occurred in this space, and having used these posts myself, I can attest to their value, and they're very well made, even though they're made in China. Yeah, they're very well made indeed. So let's have a look at yards and corrals. I think it's there's two people and families, I suppose, who've done the most. Well, Temple, insofar as yard design and having us understand better the way to manage animals using low stress handling techniques. Temple Grandin is perhaps the best known figure outside of the livestock world, but also within, owing to her multiple books, which have been bestsellers in the space. That she's had a Hollywood movie made about her because of her autism and her particular gifts of animal insight, and just the methodologies that she's created as a result. The other family and particularly person is Bud Williams, and I think I spoke about this in a Q&A recently, that Tina Williams is someone who, in the fencing layer, has Tina Williams and Richard McConnell. They're both in the workplace, and they are co-owners of Hand in Hand Livestock Solutions. Tina is the daughter of Bud Williams, the late great Bud Williams, and they've when called upon, have been really generous with their advice within the workplace. So when it comes to low stress animal handling techniques, so have a look at their fencing layer for some of their chat on that. There's the Bud Williams also has a range of, even though he's since passed, his wife has made available a number of his materials, videos and whatnot, and we can have a look at that link later. So the biggest thing to understand here, though, is that, you know, the era of that I grew up in, which was, and those past, of, you know, making all sorts of noise and rackets, and using prods and electrocution systems and all sorts of stuff, and bells and goodness knows whatever else to move animals, is well and truly, or should be well and truly, behind us. A lot of livestock producers, thank goodness, have had low stress animal handling techniques revealed to them and now use them. Certainly there are those who do not, but it would be my advice to any of you who are looking to manage livestock to understand these principles. Get some of Temple Grandin's books and others that are out there, and do some of the trainings, for there's profound benefits. It's whether it's, you know, just that whole taking of the whole machismo that goes with this kind of effort, which in itself is somewhat of a fear. It's almost like you're going to battle with the herd of animals, and going into the corral. It's sort of built the whole rodeo myth and mythology, and this whole bravado that goes around managing these large beasts, and on it goes. And it's yeah, well, it like a lot of things had its time, and that time has passed. As my good friend Alan Yeoman said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. So so the big things to understand here is that animals, animals which are prey animals, those that are preyed upon, typically, unlike us, have eyes at the side of their head, not at the front of their head. And of course, that provides a field of vision which any of us just can't understand. And so it's through these insights and understandings that help us, especially when you understand that there's a point of balance in an animal, and there's also blind spots that you can manipulate and be a part of. And that when you understand that there is a point of balance in an animal, you can see that if you're forward or back of that point of balance, you can ultimately move an animal just by being in a particular position. And that your yard design is can be equipped to have that. One of the things that a lot of systems have not had, and you can see this in this sort of design here that's influenced by Temple Grandin and by ProWay, an Australian company, is that the use of circular systems and circular routes in yards has been developed so that the destination point of an animal is not ultimately able to be seen, and that has some positive benefits. I won't elaborate too much more on that. I would certainly invite you to, if this is of interest to you, to have a really strong look at the work of Dr. Grandin and Bud Williams and so on, and get your head around this. But then also go to any of the workshops that are available, and get the management in practice. With the yards too, a lot of the material use has changed considerably. I'm sorry, I don't have the photo that I really wanted, and it's unfortunate because I had my phone stolen a couple of weeks ago when I was on holiday, and I hadn't downloaded some photos of this particular set of yards here, which my old friend Rob Laurie had developed on his property, which he's now sold in coastal hinterland of New South Wales. This particular yard setup, which he built himself, is similarly constructed to these yards, but the big difference that he did was somewhat similar to in here, how you've got this steel panel. What he did in the whole chute area, and you can sort of see that here, was, and all through here, was he lined a lot of this structure with conveyor belt. This conveyor belt from mining that he got from the mining industry. The reason why he did that was manifold. One of the reasons was because it, similar to this rectangular section iron bar here, or steel bar, is that what it allows is that what it provides is a surface that when the animals come up against it, they're not going to get damaged, because it is a place where you've got big beasts and they're moving around, and even with sheep and smaller animals, they're moving around, they're in tight bunches, there's an agitation that's involved, even with low stress handling. And so damage, and often this is the place at which the animals are about to go to be slaughtered. You know, they go from here to a truck, and then they go from a truck to the abattoir, and that's where they get slaughtered. Or it may be, if you have an on-farm abattoir, they're going to be going through an apparatus like this as well. So having a space where bruising is or the danger to bruising is reduced to a minimum is really important, because bruising obviously downgrades a carcass, and it also means, if we've got bruising, it means that the animals are under stress and so on, which is hardly what we want to do. So with that, Rob uses, as other people do, Rob use conveyor belt, because it's even softer. Pretty hard to bruise yourself when you're hitting an inch thick layer of rubber belt. The other thing that it helped Rob do, and this goes back to this diagram here, is that you can see here how you can move yourself in a position now such that animals will move backwards or forwards according to your position relative to their point of balance. So now that's okay, but when you have animals where they can see you, just you moving your center of balance or moving yourself according to their point of balance only goes so far if they're actually watching you while you're moving. So what Rob devised was he put the conveyor belt up high enough so that he could just, he wasn't not a tall man, but so that he could just walk along, and the cattle wouldn't know where he was. So he could take himself from A to B and then pop up. And if he popped himself up, say here, then they'd immediately move forward, because there'd be that point of balance difference. Whereas if he walked there, then he wouldn't have it, because there's no surprise. So he could use that belt. So it was multiple outcomes there. But it's also about this diagram. I like it because as a beef commodity producer, or commodity livestock producer, as a lot of people are, it's important to position the yards in a place where they're not only accessible to, say, a laneway network, which Rob did a very good job of with his large property of a few thousand hectares, but also it's proximate to a road, an all-weather road, and all-weather access that's relatively short. So here, Rob, with these yards, could handle a couple of hundred head, and from that, immediately put them onto a semi-trailer up this chute, and out they'd go. So plenty of room for all of that was all available. One of the things that is pretty typical, and I've hardly ever seen this being done, although I've recommended it time and time again, and I don't have any photos for it as a result of clients of our own, is the installation of permanent, of shade trees within a yard system. It's quite simple to do it, and it's sort of, I've seen a few about, but like I said, I just haven't had the clients do it for various reasons. But there's a nice set of yards not that far from here that people use Tagasasti, and Tagasasti is otherwise known as tree lucerne. And tree lucerne works really well as a very fast-growing shelter that it provides a browse to the animals, but also provides a really, like an 80% density shelter. And that's really important, because these are hot, dry areas. Typically, they're often in areas where it's a bit ridgy, because you want the drainage and so on. And so they're not humid zones. And so having that sort of additional layer of comfort for the animals is, I think, really important. The old sale yards, which are quite close, Bendigo sale yards, which were quite close to us here and have since been moved, they were all lined with trees all throughout, mostly white cedar, Melia azuridae. But I noticed the new state-of-the-art Bendigo Livestock Exchange, because it doesn't have any of that, so it's quite different. So laneways, there are lots of different configurations that we can have broadly, where we're talking both laneways and subdivision fencings, which is 3 and 4 fence categories or styles, 3 and 4 in our scale here. And each of them have different impacts insofar as, well, the total number, in a given area with a different fencing configuration, you can have different meterages of or lengths of fence within that. The different patterns can create different grazing effects, and create different labour costs and so on. They also create different outcomes as far as the integration of the water layer is concerned, particularly when you're looking at installing pipeline systems and so on. So that's something to consider. Is there any ideal? Well, I think Graham Hand's done a really great job at pointing out that systems such as either the one-way alley is a good system. In terms of cross fence, it works well. It's simple. It has a lot of cross fence, but when one considers that the cross fence itself can be not permanent, can be temporary, and then you have something of a hybrid between this portable strip grazing system and this layout. So having a centralized laneway, which might be all connect to other laneways throughout, have a perimeter fence around that, and then have 2 internal fences within, and then a portable, and then a pipeline, and then a portable trough, which enables you to move all of that, is perhaps one of the more ideal systems. One of the other systems that's been developed and is being used for a long time is this wagon wheel system. It was popularised in the 80s and 90s by Alan Savory in particular, as he went around the world. Now, this system worked well as a system on very large acreages, but doesn't really work that well at all for smaller acreages. It's in large part gone out of favour as people have shifted more to having the pipeline method, which is somewhat similar, but a bit more rectilinear, in which you've got a grid of a grid of pipeline, and then centralised trough systems which can be turned off and on. We can have a look at some of those a bit later, but these systems in particular are used for broader acre systems, like extensive systems over tens of thousands of hectares. Here's an example of a property that about 1,200 acres. I designed this, what year? 1997, December 97, so back in the day. And so this is the layout that you see, dam in every paddock, so pretty typical Australian and to an extent property in a lot of other areas where farm dams are used for livestock systems and livestock water supply. But basically a farm dam in every paddock. The average paddock size is, say, 150 to 200 acres, and the animals are set stocked. So they're put in a large area basically until all of the grazing is completed, and they've completely overutilized all that's available, and then they get moved, and there's a really basic rotational grazing system going on. But it might be after a month of grazing before they're actually moved, which obviously is not the kind of method that we recommend, having that sort of prolonged set stocking. So in our retrofit of this particular design, this was a sheep grazing property, we identified the key nodes of the site. And in this case, as a starting point, looked at using the existing dams to continue to supply the animals, and breaking down the properties down to about 15 to 20 acre sizes, or smaller, depending on if you divide them up further by these tree belts that we propose to put in. Now, you'll see here that there's a central laneway system which basically divides the property in half. And similar to this setup here, it's basically it's a mixture of these two systems here. What this does is it allows us to have very simple access and movement corridor of livestock to prime nodes. So in this area up here was the shearing shed, which is obviously an important place for a wool producing property, but also the yards, because sheep are dual purpose animals. We're getting meat and wool from them, so we need to have yards, and we also need to do operations such as crutching and footwork and all sorts of different things as well. So any different medications need to be given, and other inspections, so maintenance. So it's important to have, or it's very useful to have something like this, because in the old layout you had to there wasn't one, so you had to go from paddock to paddock, drove animals down into corners with dogs, noisy, all the rest of it, stressful for everyone concerned, and yeah, just hard to do. This type of layout makes it a lot easier. What makes it even easier is when animals are moved more frequently. What happens when you start to create the natural herding characteristics that go on with tighter density grazing systems is that leaders in the herd start to really show their leadership. And what follows when there's the creation of dominant leaders within this hierarchy of a herd, is that when they move, everyone else moves with them, and that's the way it works. So just that by virtue of getting that in practice means that the animals start to get familiar to the patterns of timing that you have in terms of moving them, and B, when they do move, the same individuals are always established or maintain their dominance by being the first ones at the gate or at the fence when you move them. So there's all of those sorts of things which emerge quite readily as a function of all of this. But it's important to have the setup to enable it, and that's part of what we're talking about here. So in terms of subdivision further from that, some of the, again, the advent of the electric fence, and particularly going on from that, the more powerful portable energizers. I grew up with small D-cell portable energizers, which were not very strong. They were designed originally, and they went back into the late 50s, early 60s. The first portable ones, and they just didn't have a lot of power, and you might be able to power one temporary wire with them. Well, now you've got really powerful ones. They've got really incredible circuitry. They can operate on batteries, which are in themselves have got a higher amperage and are much more reliable. And what you've got now is an ability to power a lot more fence at any given time. it's a general, you know, and I know a few people are on this call, for example, such as Jason Patterson, we talked about last week, that it's probable that people like Jason and others, Jemmy, your property, and a few others that are on this call, that what you'll probably have to start with is not a breeding herd, and so as a result, you'll have someone else's animals come in, but they'll all be in one herd, and so therefore there'll only be the necessity for you to initially, at least, fence off the areas where those animals are. Now, what are sort of parameters for that? Well, if we go back to here, you can sort of you can see that a lot of the time what we're fencing where there's a change in land shape, so in land elements. So as you go from a crest down into a depression, that will often be a break of slope, which is a natural division between one type of land and another, one type of yield and another, or one quanta of yield and another quanta of yield. Usually depressions, you know, flats, riparian areas, etc., have a higher quality of grass production, but they also have a higher quantity. And so it makes sense to make those available. In some situations, one can, you might have a situation where you've got this sort of shaped slope in which you can graze up and down that slope and accordingly get the benefits of both. But generally, a lot of people have more complex landscape layouts, and so we'll often look at placing the fence division where you've got that change. Now, in a lot of cases, and this is exemplified in on this particular design, what we've basically done is we've created a laneway. Now, well, in this case, there was already a laneway that ran along here, so I didn't have to do any more there. So this is a new fence layout. And then we've continued that to this back block. But the parameter for positioning the remaining fences is basically to fence off areas that we don't want livestock to go into because of either their low land capability, or that we don't want them, or we've determined that there's too much of a risk to that environment because of its state. It might be eroded. It might be really wet for a prolonged period of the year, and so on. And so you can see that in these cases, like some of these valleys were actually quite eroded, and so the narrow ones are where I've you know, that's probably only 20 meters across, and so yeah, we might have ephemeral access in there, but not for very long. And so and also, if you were to look at this land shape, if I go back up to the diagram here, this is where we've got something akin to here, where you've got this quite gentle slope running down, and then the valley itself is quite dissected and channelized. Whereas there's other areas on this property which have a different shape, which are perhaps more akin to the F shape, not the I or J shape. And accordingly, what we've done is we've opened those up so they're much wider, so that they in fact become additional paddocks. These are paddocks too, but these ones are where we've actually got a clear definition in land type, and it's actually quite viable for us to have those animals in there for an even more prolonged period. And so one might cross fence across these and get quite a lot of grazing out of them. So just have a think about that, and that's something that you'll no doubt do when you're looking at your layers and sharing it. But a starting point can be, for a lot of your fencing systems, to just simply fence out your riparian areas. But bear in mind that you may well want to You know, a lot of people, what they've done in this modern era of riparian fencing is that they've fenced, basically they fenced right up. So the fence goes, there's the landscape, and then you've got the channel going down like so. And what they've done is they've put the fence right here and right here along the channel. Now, perhaps they haven't done anything to stabilize the landscape, and so what you can and do see sometimes is that the erosion continues along here, and it gets more and more vertical, and it may well even, and you probably would have seen this, may well even start take out where the fence actually is. Now, a way that we look at remedying that is to move the fence a lot further across, and of course also look at so have the fence, you know, go right out to here, and also look at establishing other forms of vegetation in here, and do the work that we talked about last week in the forestry layer, or a couple of weeks ago in the forestry layer, of doing all the creek restoration. So you might make this, instead of right on that there, you might push that right out to 20 to 50 meters in width, so that, because a lot of producers, they'll do this because they don't want to lose any land. Well, if you push this right out 20 to 50 meters out, then you're not losing any land at all, because livestock are actually part of the management of this. Because we want, you know, one of the best things that we can get in here is, well, we want the trees because they'll give a bit of shade and protection and to the riparian system itself. So we want that, but we want deep-rooted perennial grasses, because deep-rooted perennial grasses and sedges and all of the rest of it, they're the things that are actually going to restore the soil situation here and the water cycle, not the trees. The trees are more of an aid for that. So, as opposed to a solution, they're a support. So pushing that right out on either side is, to me, a really good strategy, and it turns that now into a viable paddock, whereas before it wasn't. Because if the animals have only got this precipice to sort of go down, well, that's when you get damage and all of the rest of it. And we can actually, and it's been proven time and time again now, that if we allow animal access to these creek systems, and we do it in a pulse, and we might add to that some bale feeding or something like that in strategic areas, so that you get good ground cover, the animals will actually can start to smash down some of these almost vertical channels. Or you might even come in and as some restoration with the excavator or dozer or whatever, and smooth some of these off, and then come back in and do some bale grazing in there, and then have the animals make their mess, which will immediately then give you, just have them in there for a few days at a time, and then move them on. All of that mess will then turns into ground cover, and then turns into a site in which grasses can then establish and get their root systems. It's these root systems that we're really after here. And as they colonise, well, then that not only stabilises the situation, but it also gives you an increased amount of grazing area. Whereas this sort of situation, it's complete exclusion, which is, I don't think, any good at all. Yeah, so that's a thought that you might have, and it's interesting because a lot of people have received funding to do riparian fencing, and a lot of that riparian fencing has, as I've said, been all about exclusion, because, and I think that's reasonable, where you have set stocking and animal access is prolonged in concentrated areas, and they create really bad tracks down to creeks, and you get a lot of sediment damage and erosion and all of the rest of it. Well, I don't see that as being relevant irrelevant as a setup if you've got a planned grazing regime where it's all about appropriate utilisation and animal performance and landscape function increase. So if you're doing that, then you really need to talk to whomever's funding and saying, look, I don't want to do this because if I do it this way, then I can get it's clear that I can get much better landscape outcome, because they're concerned about landscape, water quality, and all of the rest of it. Don't let anyone tell you that doing it this way will see a decline in water quality. It will be absolutely the opposite. This ephemeral on-off style of grazing in these riparian areas will actually increase water quality, because they're only in that area for a very short amount of time, and then for the rest of the year, and being humid generally, and now increasingly humid, biodiversity will increase, and as a result, water quality will increase as well. So good thing about this sort of setup too is that a lot of, again, because of the whole set stock thing, which is sort of carried on, and the fact that because of that, you need to have really rigid fences, because the animals are not trained to fences per se. Fences are a real physical barrier, not so much of a well, they are both, but they're more of a physical barrier than a psychological barrier, you might say. Whereas electric fences are less of a physical barrier and more of a psychological barrier. And so when it comes to you investing in fencing off these areas, you might look at this and go, gee, that's a lot of fencing. But if you've got posts that are 20, 30 meters apart, and posts are the biggest, posts and end assemblies are the biggest cost in a fence, no matter what fence it is. If you widen considerably the spacing of fences, which you can do by not putting the same amount of tension through it, then you reduce the cost of the fence altogether. And you might just be able to get away with having a 1 or 2 wire fence, which is going to cost you very little indeed. It might cost you a tenth or more less per metre or per yard, per foot, than it would by comparison with existing fences. Now, we've found that talking to some authorities who give money for fencing, they're not happy with this, with giving the money. And so some of our producers that we worked with have said, well, look, we'll just do it ourselves. We were going to have to contribute anyway in some sort of cost-sharing arrangement. We'll do it our way, because then we're not sort of restricted by some of the paradigms that exist within some of the departments who provide some of this funding, because they do exist. So yeah, there's a lot in that, but quite useful. Now, this is some of the fencing, some of the hybrid fencing systems, and I've showed you this slide before when we did buildings, I think last week. And what we didn't talk about so much was this spring fencing, or we did in the terms that I said, we can move buildings really easily because of this sprung fencing. This is an innovation that and a product that comes from Harry Weir, and Harry Weir has got the Wk10 company. And Wk10, I was going to show you this later, but they've got a whole YouTube channel, as do some others that I'll talk to later. Wk10 have developed a whole methodology called, I should put this up, .co.nz, which is called techno-grazing. And techno-grazing is a system that Harry developed in 1987, as it says here on the Wk10 website. And with that, as a result of that, Harry then developed, as an inventor genius, farmer, he then developed this whole range of materials for fencing and water systems that support techno-grazing. So now, I would say that most people who use Wk10 grazing hardware fencing and water hardware don't actually practice techno-grazing, and that's something in itself that Harry is starting to come to, and his daughters and his wife who run the company are starting to come to terms with, so that they're able to provide, particularly on the water side of things, infrastructure that fits with larger herds than they run in techno-grazing systems. I'm quite happy to have a chat about techno-grazing. I think I probably will a bit more next week, but if someone wants to have a detailed chat about it, I did the Kiwi Tech techno-grazing course a few years ago as a guest of Harry and his family, and it was a brilliant course. I learned a tremendous amount, and it's a course that one would normally do if you were going to install a techno-grazing layout on your particular property. But yeah, if anyone wants to talk about techno-grazing, it's one of those topics that we could have as a special, one of those special targeted Q&As, or just have in general discussion in the workplace in the fencing, or probably the fencing layer, or you could also in the soils layer. So they've got lots of stuff. Now this sprung fencing allows, because again, as I mentioned before, when you're grazing or when you're fencing with electric fencing, the requirement to strain the fencing wire as much as you would with a traditional wire fence is not there, and so you're basically just looking at hand tensioning. So therefore, you don't need all of the wire strainers and this, all of the other apparatus that goes with traditional strained wire fences, which have considerable strain through them. So that's another advantage, if you like, of this. So while yes, you do have to buy a spring as part of the fence, the savings that you have in posts and time in installation is considerable, and of course then the flexibility in using this fence is much greater, because you don't have to worry about, you can speedily run around this property. You don't have to worry about driving all the way down to the end of the fence where the gate is. You can just simply drive straight over the fence. So there's all of those sort of flexibility options which save you a lot of time in operating your property, all of which reduces the sum cost of operations, and of course, and that's an enabled cost reduction that's enabled by the fence itself and the fence design. It's important. So some of us have already had a bit of a look at this, and over time, and I've got a couple of YouTube sessions that I developed that you can watch at any time in our library that show you how I actually came up with this design in its original phases, and now it's in its first phase and then its second phase. What we're looking at here is a fencing layout, which is more or less, this is for a pig system, more or less following a keyline layout. So that is to say that the fence lines themselves fall from the valley to the ridges. So it's following that sort of keyline pattern geometry. And so Jason Hagen did I gave him the basic instruction on how to do this for the original layout, and he used our laser level, and he'd mark out contours and then walk across those contours and lay out his fencing. For the second phase, he didn't have me do the design of this. I just gave him the parameters, the treatment, if you like. In the second phase, he went, yeah, I think I really need you to design it because it took me so much time. So which is what I said, you're going to spend a lot of time. It would be cheaper for me to lay this out. I can do it quite quickly and then you can do it. He said, no, I'll do it myself. Anyway, found out the hard way. And so the second phase of this particular project, as you can see, have developed a much simpler layout, because all of these different turns that he's got here are individual posts and springs, and they're concreted in, and there's extra springs and extra fitting, and on it goes. All of that stuff increases the sum cost of the fence per metre. So this setup, however, is much simpler, does the same job in terms of layout, is all equidistant, whereas systems here were not, and so on and so forth. So there is a value where you do have the right systems in place, like the right topography and whatnot. I think that we can get a lot of value in doing this. The other thing that we did in this context was, because of the resolution of this layout was such that it only needed the precision of the GPS on a mobile telephone to set it out. In other words, using we use GPS kit in this case, you could navigate to each one of these points and put a post in to mark out where the actual fence would be. And so that's what Jason did. And we checked it out, and it was within within a couple of meters of accuracy when I went there with the precision GPS and checked it out. So, you know, again, where if I was doing something that required ultimate precision, then I'd use a higher level piece of survey or higher precision piece of survey instrumentation. But in this case, we just didn't need it because, you know, it wasn't wasn't required to be at that level. Now, Bruce Davison is on the workplace as well, and I love these photos of Bruce's subdivision fencing. I think it's just beautiful fence craft, and I enjoyed these lessons that I had with my grandfather, God rest his soul, as a young man and as a child indeed. Just learning all of the knots and learning this and learning that and learning the process of setting out fences and setting a whole thing up. And this took me back to my childhood, was Granddad Dole was raised in the Depression, and so he was born in 1915. So he was 15 in 1930, and worked on his own farm, and then worked around as a roustabout and all the rest of it. And he picked up a lot of skills and then brought them back home when he bought the farm off his brothers. And in doing so, did it out of the seat of his pants. And as a lot of people do, and they don't tend to do it as much now, a lot of people would do back then is they would reuse everything as many times as possible until it basically disintegrated. Now, understand that fences are like buildings. They are degenerative infrastructure. So, and you can see that with these posts, they're rusting. So that means at some stage in the future, and this is a coastal property, these posts will return to the soil, and I'm sure that the base of these have done so. Although I do know that Bruce adds a bit of lime to his property, which is changing the acidity. Notwithstanding, there's a lot of layouts and this is something that you'll have to assess. There are a lot of fenced layouts which are composed of fencing materials, particularly steel posts, which you might look at and go, gee, it wouldn't take that much to pull all of that fencing up, pull up a lot of those fence posts, and then reconfigure the layout. That's something you'll have to evaluate. It's certainly a lot easier to do that with steel posts, whether they're T-posts in Canada and the US and Mexico, or whether it's these Y-shaped star pickets or star posts as we have in many other parts of the world. I think they were German originally. Anyway, you can, if you may well evaluate that, the cost and value to you of having a improved layout which has laneways, which has smaller paddocks, which follows more landscape lines and so on, which fits in better with your water systems layout, all of that stuff, you may evaluate that works for you. And so go to the trouble and expense of dismantling an existing fence and then recovering its materials. Probably not the wire, because the wire is probably most likely, well, you'd evaluate it. You can certainly use a fencing wire reel to undo a fence and salvage the wire. There's no problem with doing that. But the posts in themselves are much easier to salvage and then reuse. Now, Bruce has shown us here that through some really simple knots, even end assemblies under strain, with strained electric fencing, can do a really good job where you just have good fence craft and good use of the right gauge wire. So Bruce has used some gripples here, and he's got very wide spacing, probably 30 or 40 meters of spacing in between the individual star pickets. Now, we all will have seen a lot of fences where posts are inordinately close together, and this continues to this day. And why is this the case? Well, there's a few reasons for it. One is because if we have prefabricated fencing, well, that is wire panel fencing, they tend to be fences that require a number of posts at particular spacings, and those spacings have been engineered to an extent. They've also been engineered to understand that that the limiting factor to the strain in itself is not just the wire, but the end assembly. And so if the end assembly is relatively undersized or of the wrong configuration, that is, the strongest end assembly is what's called a box end assembly. It's where you've got a wire that goes, a post that goes here. Whoops. A post that goes, oh, why won't that draw? Draw. Oh, I don't know why it won't draw. Clear, annotate. Right, annotate, text, draw. Oh, why won't it let me? Okay, that is so annoying. Annotate. Okay, you got a post here and another post here, and they're into the ground at usually 4 feet or 1 meter deep is what is the ideal for a traditional timber end assembly. So you can post here, post there. Ideally, these posts would be driven into the ground, because a driven post has a lot more strength than a post that's been traditionally, the hole's been dug out and then the post has been rammed in or tamped in. So you have that, and then you have another post, or a stay as it's called, which goes across like this, and then there's a peg that goes in here and a peg that goes in there, and then there's a few straps of wire which wrap around here like so, and then from that, then the wires are attached to this post and off they go in that direction. That's the strongest end assembly that you can create. Now, if you do that and it's done well, then you can widen out the spacing that you'd otherwise have between the posts and have what's called a suspension fence. I won't go into too much detail on this, but these are possibilities. One of the biggest reasons why people have posts at too high a spacing is that A, they get their advice from the suppliers of fencing materials, and B, they take their advice also from the contractors who are making a fence for you. Now, it's very rare that you will find a fencing contractor. In fact, I've barely even heard of such an occurrence of a fencing contractor who really strays from the regional styles of fencing. And accordingly, because, the bush telegraph is such that if I had a fencing contractor who was getting out there, and let's say I opened up a fencing business and I started to do fences like Bruce here, I'd probably get a fair name for myself as being a fence maker who's pretty shit. Now, that may not be justified at all because the fence actually works perfectly fine and does its job, but the bush telegraph will be such that I'll get my bad little name, and before too long, you know, you as a newcomer comes into the district, oh, what fencing contractor? Oh, don't do there. They make terrible looking fences. Or you go to the local fencing supplier, you know, whatever the rural store is, and they said, oh no, we don't use them. And you go, oh, right, yeah, they don't do it. They don't do a good job. There you go. There's your point of authority. And you go, okay, well, who does? Oh, our mate over here, he does, and this mate, he does a beautiful job, you know, buys all our stuff, uses quality gear, blah, and on it goes, right? So that's how it works. So what you end up with is you've got this sort of cartel of information and behaviour which over fences and overcharges people across whole continents for fences when it's absolutely not necessary. And that's something you're going to have to really pay attention to. And that's why it's important to inform yourself. Like even this sort of thing, like what Bruce has done here is really clever. I've long been an advocate of and suggested to people that they go to landfills and buy and go to the section that has trampoline springs. Trampoline springs, you can get them for next to nothing. If you go and buy springs, go to a hardware store and look at how much springs are next time you're in there, and just you'll be blown away how much a spring is. Go to a landfill shop, recycle shop at a landfill or whatever, and you'll go to the trampoline spring section because trampolines always decay, and they're great little frames. They're always heavily galvanized because they're outside and so on. Really good materials. You can use them just as, so you can buy your Wk10 La springs, and they're really good because of particular properties like they hyperextend. But for doing gates and all of that sort of stuff, that's what Bruce has used here. He's just used the trampoline spring, which has created the spring, connected that to a bit of wire, put a bit of PVC over the top that he's had laying around and a bit of old tape, and hey presto, he's got a gate. Now you can go and buy that piece if you want, but it'll cost you 20 or 30 bucks. So there's all of these sorts of elements, and then all these things add up. And if you're not fazed about the aesthetics completely, then and you're more of a form person, not a more of a function person than a aesthetic form person, and you're okay with people sort of looking at your stuff and going, oh, right, well, people who've done this have got margins that people who have not don't. That's what it comes down to, and that's a very important point in this. You can spend an inordinate amount of money fencing. It's quite extraordinary, which is why I'm sort of labouring the point a bit here, and why Bruce's stuff is so good. So other, whoops, go back to there, clear. Other stuff that Bruce has done, you can see here more detail. In this case, this is a different model. He's used a bit of polypipe on his trampoline spring. But you can see also, one of the things I don't like about fencing is its imposition on the landscape itself. It's a visual, it creates a visual. Now, you may feel very differently about this, of course, but my opinion is that, yeah, I grew up with fences that had to be perfectly straight. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, my cousin Tim and I built a fence, and we would have been 14 or 15, and it was about half a K long. And we thought we followed all of the spec. It was with split timber posts that were probably about, I don't know, 30 meters apart. And then there were in between the posts were steel star pickets like this. And there was 5-wire, barb on top, barb in the middle, barb on the bottom, and then 2 planes in between. And then a really big end assembly that was, probably in the order of 40 centimeters in diameter and a 4-foot deep hole, which we had to dig by hand with bar and shovel. So and then did the same with all of the posts that were all along. They were all 4 foot down as well. So we did all of that labour, and it happened to be a fence that was perpendicular to the road that faced our property. And I remember, like yesterday, the old bloke said he came up to us because he drove to the pub, the Farmer's Arms, and he drove past and he noticed that a couple of the posts were not perfectly out. He said, you know, when I drive past the fence, I'm not happy unless I get this sort of, you get this when you drive past it, and you'll notice this when you drive past fences next time you do it. You'll go past it and you almost get like this whip effect. It's almost like a strobe light. If you don't do it while you're driving, but if you sit in the passenger side and you'll just see a fence which is perpendicular to the roadside, and it'll go along, and then it sort of, as you go past, it'll almost, that the straightness of it will hit you like a strobe. And that's the effect that he said he wanted, and he wasn't getting it. He actually said there's a kink. And he said, you know, when I went down to the pub, his mates at the pub, other farmers, said, dude, Frank, you did a nice job on that fence, mate. Like saying, no, you didn't do a nice job on the fence. Now that affected, again, this is part of the psychology of rural people, especially more traditional ones, that affected his reputation from the way he said, because these people were asserting that he was not doing a good job. And even by extension, us being his grandsons doing this job, without him not laying down the law and us not following his tight specification, was a reflection on him and his character and his ability, and that just was not on. So we had to go and fix that up. So we'd take out, I don't know, move 3 or 4 big posts, redig the whole, you know, and so on. But this is the kind of stuff that goes on. And it is, I mean, it does not matter that that fence is not absolutely straight. Certainly, if it was a foot or so out, then yeah, it would, because as you put a lot of strain on a fence and you've got posts which are right out of kilter, it's going to put a lot more stress on those posts than it will on them. Then it'll cause them to tip over time with a bit of stock pressure and so on. So there's all of that goes into that. So now, I personally look at those sorts of fences now. I just don't like them because they create this visual in the environment which is overwhelming and dominating. And yeah, so personally, I would much prefer to have fences in the landscape which are largely invisible, and the most visible parts of fences are posts. And with a lot of posts that we're using now, or post distances, and using little fiberglass ones and whatnot, you can barely see them from a roadside, for example, or from your broader vista, which is fantastic in my opinion, because your eye is now dominated by the shape of the landscape and its beauty and all of the other features, and not these constructs. Anyway, just my opinion there. More of Bruce's stuff. This is a cool one where he's put that over, and then so he's bent the fence over here. So he's stuck that in and then bent it over, and then that in itself, and done the same with this, that bend there has created a stress which increases the strength of this end assembly. Yeah, beautiful work. Love it. All right. Enough fence, Bruce Davison fence porn. Let's get on to temporary fences now. So we talked a bit about Kiwi Tech before. These are some of their setups, and I won't belabor these. You can look at their catalogue and you can look at some of the videos and whatnot, so you can see that. One of the important things to understand, again, and we're talking about time and motion studies and being efficient and having more time, you know, all of you, when you've done your holistic context, I don't think I remember any of you at any time during this program or others saying, I want to spend the quality of life thing, saying, I want to get out there and do lots and lots of fence moving. I didn't see that. So that being the case, and a lot of you say, oh, well, gee, I want to run an economic operation. Well, those things being the case, when it comes down to the tools that we use and the tests that will apply to the use of different tools, I find it difficult to go past, and if I could, I would, these types of systems which you can very quickly put fencing out and then move it as you need to. as you need to have your animals migrate across your property according to your grazing plan. So very good stuff. You can certainly make do with setups which, you know, probably don't. I'd have to say Kiwi Tech is so cheap that it's pretty hard to go past it in terms of the comparison of where you've got, you know, pigtail tread-ins and all of that sort of stuff. There's not much of a cost saving there, and certainly not in terms of materials and especially in terms of use. So I find it pretty hard to go past this kit. So that's something to consider, but you have a look and see, make your own mind up. And I talked about the kit insofar as you being able to drive over it and all of that because of the springs. You will need to, with a lot of cases, with a lot of your vehicles, put some sort of what's it called, rod system, circular rod, a round rod, under the chassis of the vehicle, so that when you drive over it, particularly with quads, because their undercarriage is quite low to the ground, or comparatively low to the ground, so that when you drive across the fence, it doesn't get caught. Now, I've seen people, Tom Bradman's the fastest I've seen, he's driven across one of these fences at 50 k's an hour, which is incredibly crazy to be hurtling down a hill on a four-wheel bike towards a fence. It's sort of like, this is not going to end prettily. And he did that, no problem, just bang, straight through it, or straight over it, I should say, because he had the right kit. So, yeah, it's very interesting. Other fences, this is at polyface. This is a method that a lot of people will use, or materials that a lot of people will use. You can buy what's called these, I think Staffix and a few other companies sell them around the world. Staffix is a New Zealand company that markets product around the world. You can get nice little coil type ones too. I've seen them about too. There's sort of a sprung insulated wire, heavy wire that clip on, that you sort of open, and then they spring on to onto a rod. This is a bit of half-inch deformed bar, or rebar as it's also known. I've worked out that the cost of this and Kiwi Tech in most markets is about the same. So you can do that. The big advantage, I shouldn't say advantage. One of the advantages of this setup is if you do have stonier ground, or then it's a lot easier, especially for a temporary fence, to just go along with a little 1 kilo hammer and a 2-pound maul, and just hammer that fence in and give it a tap at the bottom, and then pull it out and take it. They're obviously heavier than fiberglass posts, but you just put a point on them and take them around, and away you go. They set up pretty well. So that's for pig fencing. You can see here they've run along with a slasher or whatever first up to just establish that line, and that's something that some people will do ahead of time. Now, one of the things that this all enables, and this is a good illustration, a lot of people say, oh, they don't keep animals in. That's 700 cows there, and the scariest thing that they've ever seen is this one hot wire. That's just one hot wire holding back 700 cows, right? That's 700 cows each. It's like 500,000 kilos of meat. 400,000 kilos of meat. It's a lot of weight of animal, and they're all sitting there captive to this wire, this hot wire, which has got 6 or 7 or 8 kilovolts running through it in a pulse. I find that incredible. The other thing that we can do with that, particularly when we go with multi-wire fences, is have a so-called flirred, and that's where, which I think is a really great scenario, and that's where you'll have multiple species running in one herd. It's quite, I won't say it's common, but it's not uncommon for livestock properties, particularly larger ones where you might have herds of 200 or more animals, to run a couple of goats with the herd. And the purpose of the goats is to clean up some of the thistles and the other things that particularly in set stock systems, where the management system is not developed to promote non-selective grazing, where you've got more selective grazing, which tends to be when you've got more open, slower, set stocked grazing. But notwithstanding, even in even in one of these setups where you've got more frequent moves and higher density grazing, having multiple species mixed together does provide a whole range of ecosystem benefits, as well as the potential for diversification of income that comes from your system as well. So that's something else to consider. But of course, if you're running sheep and goats, then you're not going to be able to keep them back with one wire. You're going to have to go with probably three, and that's why these sorts of systems exist, where you've got 3 polywire setups, not just 2. This is an example of a setup I did or a design schematic, if you like, I did for a project in southern Spain about 7 years ago or so now. Actually, no, 9 years ago now. And these people had some bush up the top, which is in that part of the world is called the dehesa, which is wide-spaced cork and holm oak trees. You know, the trees are sort of 20 to 30 metre spacings, and then you've got pasture in between. Now, those areas have traditionally been, this property was about 260 hectares, and those areas have traditionally been grazed quite extensively. So they put the animals in there, they graze them, and it all gets gets the usual outcome of overgrazing, and you get landscape function decline and so on. So I said, well, how about we bring this system into modernity a bit? And some of the weak points in it were that as a starting point, we didn't have a water layout. So one of the ways to address that was to set up a trailer with a 1 or 2 cubic metre water tank, some flexible hose, and as I showed you in the water layer, I think enable you to have a flexible water trough. In this case, the suggestion of a 600 litre trough, which would service quite a few animals in the 4-hour time period. And then use the trees themselves as posts with a portable energizer, with a single or multi-strand system. Now, of course, that extends to the other question of, well, how do I fence animals in a dry climate? Well, that's where you might go with a multi-wire system, and the reason for that is because the circuit that provides the power that the animal closes. So an animal touches a fence, it has to be earthed. So its feet have to be earthed in order for the circuit to be closed for it to receive a shock. Now, you can avoid that shock by putting on the right pair of rubber boots, which have a low amount of carbon like electricians wear, and you can buy them. And then you can physically go up and touch the fence and you'll just feel a mild pulse. You won't get shocked because you haven't completed the circuit. But for an animal, then obviously not wearing the boots. Now, if you have really dry soil, and particularly if the earth rod is in dry soil, well, then it means that the circuit is not going to be closed as well. And so that instead of the animal getting a jolt with, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 volts, they might get 1 or 2,000 volts, and it's just not enough for the fence to be a psychological barrier. And so one of the ways that we overcome that is by doing a couple of things, one of which is called an earth return. So you have 2 wires, one which is hot and they're close enough and together, one which is positive and one which is negative and is effectively an earth. And so that as the animal inevitably touches both wires, it will then get the shock. And that's one way of addressing that. Another thing that people do is that they may well set the energizer up in proximity to the trough, so that that the soil is moistened. And when the soil is moistened, then the earth is much more likely to occur, and then that will transfer to the system. So other people do other things as well, which is really great, and that's where you get a little 20-litre drum and just put a pinhole in it full of water, and you put that next to the earth rod, and that pinhole just drips water down. Some people put bentonite down or salt and other sorts of things like that. I find that method of just putting a bucket of water or something like that with a pinhole, which just weeps and drips down deeply as slowly delivered water will, then that provides all you need. Now, I was inspired by that when I went to Polyphot, this particular concept, by talking to Joel Salatin, because he'd been using nylon rope around his trees for pig fencing, and I thought, gee, that's a great idea. As you can see here at Polyface Farm, portable energizer, earth rod, hooked her up, so negative to the earth rod, just a little 1000 or one joule energizer with a small battery there, probably a 40 amp battery or so, and just a deep cycle marine, and which you can hot swap. Something like that will last for 30 or 40 days, by which time you're moving the animals sufficiently enough to be able to inspect it regularly with a little fence tester. But this sort of setup, this was at Taranaki Farm where we did some work, and we took that idea there, and again, for pig fencing, just went around with some nylon rope, wrapped that around trees, and hey presto, you've got a fence out in the bush, and you can graze areas really, really effectively. And that's something, we're talking Jason Patterson, we're talking about at your place about doing a bit of thinning and getting your animals into there and so on. That's something you can do in there. We've got some other photos on that, so if you want to raise that issue with us and you want to talk about how do we use fences for posts, or how do we safely do this without damaging trees, which obviously is important. We've certainly got quite a few photos on how people have dealt with that. But that's a really good method. And then you undo the rope, and then you go again, go somewhere else. Portable energizers were something. This again is at McIver Farm, and Jason has a bit of a play with this sort of thing. As you can see here, he's just got a nice little low maintenance sealed battery here, which he's bought at an electrical store, and a small energizer, a solar panel, which is sized to suit the requirement of the battery, and away you go. He just faces that towards the sun, and he's got a really robust energizer. Put a little roof on there for the energizer, and away you go. So, pretty cheap setup for his heavier systems where he's got a lot more pressure. This is where he's got his sow systems, for example. This one, he's got a bigger battery. This one is set up on a bigger frame so that he can come along with the forks of his tractor and move this, because it's just that much heavier, with I think this is a 200-watt panel, and away we go. So that's a more expensive setup, but it's designed to work in an area that's got a lot more a lot more meterage of wire to charge, and to keep the charge up. The other thing here is that he has these areas sometimes of the year have a lot more grass up against the wire, and so the resistance in the wire requires that you put a lot more energy through the wire, which means you've got a lot more, so you've got to put a lot more amperage through the wire, to keep the volts up high. So you might think, in this context, you might think of electricity and this system as being that the voltage is the flow rate and the amperage as the pressure, if you were to look at it from the perspective of a water system. So the flow rate is the voltage and the amperage is the pressure. And if you have a lot of different outlets, then you flow off that main, then the flow rate will probably start to diminish, but so will the pressure. And as the pressure declines, as the amperage declines, well, then the amount of energy that's able to go through declines, and therefore animals start to not get the hit that they need to continue to respect it. So yeah, very, very good. Now this is another system I found when I did a short course in California a few years ago, and another one of these systems that farmers have come up with. I've just bought some trolley jacks, set up a little solar panel on there, hung an energizer, in this case a 3-joule energizer, and a little battery pack which they bought in an automotive store, and in one of those containers that you can buy. Really simple setup, but these are the sorts of things that you can do. So just to give yourself the ability to have a high-powered energizer out there to do some, to put some serious grunt through some quite long lengths of fence. So you can fence off some considerable areas where you've got competing pressures of, say, green grass growing up against the other vegetation, and still keep the power up. All right, as we come to the end, we'll see if we've got any questions and whatnot as well. There's quite a few books that I've got as reference to this sort of broader topic. This one's a beautiful one. I haven't got it yet. I've flicked through it when I was at a field day, but I do need to get it. And that's The Art and Science of Shepherding by Michel Mouret and Fred Provenza. A lot of people would have heard of Fred. I've not met him, but he has come to Australia a few times, and he's in the US. So if any of you are in the US or do get the opportunity to do a program with him, I don't know if Michel Mouret does courses at all, but that sort of thing is, there's emerging evidence that that shepherdry, where it's done in conjunction with holistic planned grazing and the right value channel, is actually cheaper than doing fencing. So that's another play on all of this. So that's something to be considerate of. So obviously there's going to be factors that allow for that, but yeah, it's something to consider. But at the very least, it's the concept of shepherdry and where one does it with the consideration of how it works with low stress animal handling and so on, and why animals are moved from area to area and so on. Always something to learn. Wires and Pliers by the Condon Group. The Condon Group is a organisation in Western Australia who, for a long time here in Australia, have been putting out some really great manuals on a variety of different things. There's a quite a range of manuals they've got there. Wires and Pliers, I don't know that you can still get it. You may well still be able to, but it's excellent. They've always worked where they've got their own agricultural engineers, and they talk about all of the engineering specs on stuff, but then they have case studies from their member farmers, which are really, really useful. And I'm inspired. I've long been inspired by the Condon Group, and I'd love one day for our agrarians workplace to sort of function in this way. But so you can take that on in the way that you too participate and contribute to the improvement of not only your own property but by sharing your examples, help others improve their circumstances as well. They also have these research reports in which they talk about updates to technology, because this book's probably 15 years old. This other book, Fencing Fundamentals, has come out. I don't think it's quite as good as this, but it's updated on the wires and pliers. Then they got then you've got this other report which has come out on exclusion fencing, because that's become quite important. And then you're looking at some of the guides that are out there from your various natural resource or agriculture departments. This one's from the New South Wales Department of Industry and Investment, and they've got this series of ag guides, which they have on all sorts of things, including electric fencing, as you see here. I also mentioned some catalogues. Fencing catalogues are really useful. Yes, they have often have specs which I may not agree with, but you know, are about selling their gear. But you know, you can always read it between the lines and take a bit of a look at what people are doing in terms of spacing and whatnot, and give things a go. But that said, fencing manuals I find are really useful tools to help us to design and set up fences and spec them out. In terms of the next section here is to look at the YouTube channels that are out there. There's 4 really good YouTube channels which are sort of my go-to references. One is Wk10. They've got a lot of stuff in here. You can go for your life in there and have a really strong look. Another one is this gentleman in Brazil who uses the Wk10, but he uses it in the context of the techno grazing system, and so it's really interesting to see it all set up in that way. They're quite good. Strainright, it's one of those companies that has a range of different products, and there again, you may not use these products, but they're useful to sort of look at to help you if you haven't done any fencing before, or you don't have a buddy who's going to be able to help you. Then you know, these sorts of things are pretty straightforward and will help you to get the right gear and to set a fence up properly. Lastly in this series is this one from Fence Line Solutions. They have a really good range of stuff in which they show you how to do various knots and how to join, but you know, all sorts of stuff, which I find really, really useful and have over the journey. So have a look there. I could also show you, I think we've got ClipX here, probably. There's ClipX. There's a lot of different channels now of people who've got theirs. There's probably others as well. Okay, so with that, the usual task work, existing fencing, what's its condition? Are we going to, how is it placed? What's the future of it? What are we looking at, as we talked about before? What are the opportunities for retrofitting, for replacement, future development? And then lastly, with your Google Earth Pro layer, is trying to look at develop a layout with your fencing and annotate them and share them. Furthermore, you might start to spec them in terms of how many posts, how many end assemblies, how many gripples, you know, all of that. What are all the components? Because when one does that, then you can start to cost things out and cost one form of fence versus another, so you can compare apples with apples. All right, that's all I have, apart from this lovely knot, because I love doing a good figure 8. It's a great little knot because it doesn't need a joiner. Yeah, so nice knot to be able to do. So if anyone's got any questions, please put your hand up, click on your hand up, and away we'll go. Oh, there we go. Up we go. Ray and Samantha. Good morning, Samantha and Ray.
Good morning, Darren. How are you?
Very well.
You know of anybody using Wk10 fencing with wooden posts?
Yeah. The wooden posts go with you use them for the end assemblies.
End assemblies and changes of direction.
And changes. Well, yes and no, because if you look at what do I do with that? If you look at the Wk10 catalog, which I'll just
you can use the fiberglass posts for changes of direction.
Yes. I'll just show that so other people are familiar with what we're talking about, right? Wk10. So, that's way too big. So when you run a Wk10 fence along, you can run it in, like you can see along this cliff, for example, with these posts, these arrow-headed posts. you can stab them in on an angle. Now these posts, because of their construction, they're fiberglass embedded into this, oh geez, it'll be about a 300 or 400 long sleeve of polyethylene, at the bottom of which is an arrow, a plastic arrow. Now that will bend over 90 degrees, so you can drive over it and whatnot. Now the corollary of that is that you can also, as you go along a fence, you say for this post here, even though I've got an end assembly at either end, I can, instead of having to put a wooden post at every change of direction, you can use this ability of these posts to flex to 90 degrees by driving them in at the opposite direction or opposite angle to which the strain is going to come. So in other words, this post that's up here, for example, let me do that, annotate. Can I do that? No, annotate. Oh, yeah, okay. So this post here, I'm going to put in on this angle. This one here, I'm going to put in on this angle, and so on, so that when the strain comes up, it's going to stand up like that. But yeah, you'll use whatever post you would ordinarily, or just whatever's cheapest available to you for the end assemblies.
For us, with our rubbish timber, we can get a few posts out of them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's work I enjoy doing.
Good, and you got a bit of it.
Yeah. So for using, say, 2 wires for pigs and for cattle, are you aware of some the fastest ways to move those things on a wooden post? So we know that the Kiwi tech of how easy are they? Because that's what the Hagens do, don't they? They just slide the wires up.
Yeah, well, we'll just go and have a look at Hagens, because that's probably the easiest way to deal with that question. Annotate. Oh, hang on. Pardon me. Here's an example of their setup. Yeah. So they've got, this is pretty early days. So we've got a 3-wire setup here.
Okay.
They were running a lot more sheep at this stage, and then they went back. Then they went to cattle, and now they're doing sheep again. So with this, because Jason's shifted from having a star picket attached to here. I think you can see that in another photo. Where do I have that? Here, this one here. You can see how he's got a star picket there. If you don't have that on the round, then it's actually quite easy for you to move up and down this. In this case, this is drill pipe, because Jason was able to get a lot of drill pipe cheaply, and so that was his end assembly. And so you could quite easily move that up and down as a result. And similarly, along the on the post itself, Jason uses the little plastic clip on the post. Where'd that go? Yeah. He uses the little plastic clip. Where are they?
I did see them, yeah.
Yeah. He uses this one, which is relatively easy to you just hammer that up, and then you can move that up and down. At our place, I use this one.
Yeah.
Because you can just go along with a pair of multi-grips and then just grab it on that side and lift it up and down. Ditto with this type here, you can move that up and down. So you don't actually need to undo the setup to move these top ones.
Right. So they're wedge clip widgets. They're a pain in the bum to move.
They're more problem. Yeah. Because you actually have to physically. It's not hard. You just go along with it, like Harry or myself or Jason, we just use the back of a spanner,
Mhm.
and you just whack that up. You don't have to like physically or completely dislodge the wedge. You just give it a little whack. That takes it out. You then, hold it in one hand, give it, and put your finger sort of, I can see what I'm doing here. I can put my finger on the top of the wedge at the same time as holding on to the clip.
Oh, yeah.
And then just give it a little tap underneath. That loosens it. It might just push it up a centimetre. That loosens it enough. Push it up, and then just whack it back down to when you've got it to the height. That's it. Very simple.
I think the last time I looked at the Kiwi-Tech catalogue, which is only a couple of weeks ago, it's like 2013 or something was the date on the catalogue.
Yeah.
Would that be?
Yep.
Current?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, they haven't changed their pricing much at all. They're different. They're a different mob.
That's impressive.
Yeah, well, the prices, like I said, I mean, it's the sort of stuff though, because of the freight costs, and because they're they don't have a retail outlet, all the rest of it, or distribution system. You might want to get around with some friends in the area. Talk to a Helen Lewis, talk to the others in your holistic management group, or otherwise, or even your land care group, and say, "Oh, look, I'm looking at getting some of this in. Does anyone else want to buy some so that the shipment costs are lower?" Not that it's out of only coming from New Zealand, but even so, and it all helps.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Darren. Appreciate
it. No worries at all. My pleasure. Enjoy the week.
Shall do.
Okay. Any other questions people have got? Okay. I should just make mention too, I'm going to be going up to, I've got a workshop on the weekend, which some of you will be familiar with Ulrico in at his property or someone's property in Brunswick Heads. He's doing a syntropic agroforestry thing up there, and I'm doing a forestry and practice workshop on kombucha. I think that one of my kids. So yeah, I'm doing a syntropic workshop. Sorry, not a syntropic, a forestry and practice workshop on his property on Saturday and Sunday. And so because of that, my flight is leaving at 11 o'clock. So I'll have to shift the Q&A to this Thursday. So it'll be a day earlier, because we just confirmed that it was going on. The numbers were fairly low, so we just confirmed that yesterday. So I just booked my flights, and that was that. So Thursday will be the Q&A for this week, not Friday. Outside of that, everything else continues, and then on next Tuesday, I will be still up in the region, and I'll do the next presentation for soils when I'm up there. Okay. I think Blair's on the call. I'll be catching up with him, so look forward to that again. All right, well, looks like you're all done. So that's being the case. Thank you all very much. Got a few things to go. Please, I put up yesterday that I want people to, I want to do a lot more of the Q&A style thing. I think people, the private messaging I get back from people is that they do like it when we deal with single issues in Q&As, and often that's how the Q&As tend to work out anyway, because I carry on so much. But I'd really love to be able to open up this space to all of you this year, and quite a few of you have had a look at that. So have a look at that thread in the home page of targeted topic Q&A sessions. And if you yourself are interested in leading a session, you've got something you'd love to talk about, whatever it is, then maybe just let us know. I'll probably end up, by the look of it, creating a group which will manage that. And then you can nominate a time and a date. And I'll just send you the codes to Zoom and our codes to Zoom, and off you go. And you can deliver a session. I'll investigate to see whether you can deliver a session within the workplace itself without having to go through Zoom as well. But I think it's hard to do without. It's hard to do a screen share. But anyway, I'll work that out. But whatever the case, you can do it through Zoom, which is pretty easy. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, everyone, and I'll look forward to catching up with you through the week. Take care. All the best.